Jerry, where does this podcast find you?
Well, this morning I'm in New York, and I think that that's both a geographic and an emotional question, isn't it? So I am in New York, and I'm here because just a few days ago, my daughter gave birth to my first grandchild.
I didn't see that. Congratulations. What a wonder.
And I will tell you that where that leaves me is kind of walking on cloud nine in a way that I sort of anticipated, but could not fully appreciate. And so my heart is quite full of love today.
That's wonderful and refreshing and important to hear, especially, in the times that we live in. And I know that our daughters share names, which is something very wonderful. And my Emma just turned 10. And I saw some of the photos of, her meeting her grandparents on day 2. And so I cannot imagine what it feels like. But thank you for sharing that. For those people that, although there's probably not a lot listening to this podcast that don't know about you or of you, but for those that don't, can you give us a little bit of a sense for who you are, what you do, what drives you before we jump into some of the questions that I have for you?
Well, I want to give you the flat answer. I want to give you the answer that is alive and real for me. So who am I? The CV would list a whole bunch of different jobs and careers over the years, from investor to founder to executive coach now, whatever the heck that means. The thing that occurs to me that's probably most relevant to our conversation is to tell a quick story that I've often written about and I wrote about in my first book, Reboot. And that is when in 2008, when I went into the desert to do a water-only fast as part of this sort of reclamation project that I was on myself. And by the way, no substances were ingested. No plant medicine or anything like that. I had this deep and profound encounter with a ponderosa pine tree. And every time I passed the pine tree, I would hear this name, Holder, Holder, Holder. And what emerged was the deeper name of Holder of Stories of the Heart. So I am Holder of Stories of the Heart. I use that capacity to help people become better leaders by engaging with the process of being a better human. That's me.
And that is, in fact, you. So I can speak from my own personal experience with you holding a story of my heart. And I actually wanted to start us off with saying a really huge thank you to you on the record. Because when I met you, which is over 12, 13 years ago, when
I had hair.
And you gave a talk called Bill Gates, Jesus and Me at a VC event. And you quite literally changed the trajectory and the direction of my life because I got to score a very rare one-on-one coaching session with you. And I was coming in complaining and I left reflecting, and really that kicked off my own journey of self-discovery and, then starting to work with my now longtime coach, now close friend and mentor, David. And, it's been a journey ever since, but
Did I ever send you a bill?
You actually didn't.
Oh, man.
But it was profound in many, many ways at a time where I didn't even know I needed it. But looking back, it was really the one thing that kicked it off, because the world that I come from and that I got to discover through this, coaching, self-discovery, even self-understanding is just not a thing. And so that conversation with you was deeply profound. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. 2 things I would say in response to that. There's an old Buddhist teaching that I have found to be proven right again and again and again. And that is, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And sometimes the teacher doesn't even know that they're a teacher in that moment.
Yeah. And you have been, after that, I consumed religiously the Reboot podcast and told everyone about it. And then eventually when your book came out, I consumed the audiobook, and it was I was on a drive. It was a 7-hour session with you, which was.
Again, did I send you a bill?
You
No.
didn't. No. At least I paid for the book. And so, that was Reboot and then Reunion. It's the same thing. I actually remember the drives I was on and all of that. So, no, it's been wonderful and life-changing in many ways.
Well, the second thing I was going to say is, so you're familiar enough with my work, so you know the phrase that I use all the time, which is radical self-inquiry. And the point I make about that self-inquiry process, the reason I call it radical is because we're socialized not to do it. We're taught to stay safe requires us not to ask ourselves the deeper questions. And I suspect that in the talk I did, and I think I remember the location of that, it was like a pseudo East Berlin, let's pretend that it was a kind of decrepit place, but it was really a fine place kind of
It was
thing.
the Soho House.
Oh, it was the Soho House, even more,
Yes,
right?
but it is a former East Berlin kind of even public official building.
It's like a Stasi headquarters
Exactly.
is what it was.
It was something
but
like
very
that.
hip.
Yes.
I remember the location, but I probably made this point, which was that sometimes the most radical self-inquiry question we can ask ourselves is, how am I actually feeling? Without any bullshit, without any pretending, without any mask. And I remember early on in my shtick, in my gigs, where I would travel to places like Berlin and give talks. I still do that, but now I don't do any slides because I'm just too lazy. What happened is I would often open up with a joke about being the guy who makes people cry. And then I would tease and I'd say, well, you know how I make people cry? I ask them a question, how are you? And so actually to the folks listening right now, you had us land, just take a minute. How are you actually feeling? The world is a fucking dumpster fire these days, right? There's a rise of authoritarianism as an answer to the fear. There's profound divisiveness. We, more so than I have ever seen in my 62 years, distrust one another. Here in the States, we have children shooting children in schools. It's like, what the fuck? And yet new life comes in and it's a promise. And it's a challenge. What is the world that we are going to leave behind? So when we allow the space for the fullness of who we are to show up, it's part of that journey of being fully human, part of that journey of being a better human in that way.
Yes. And this exact moment is, why I wanted to talk to you. And actually, you've been on my list for a while. And as I said, leading into this, we didn't record that part, but I'll say it out loud. I was probably the first time I was actually nervous having this interview, because of the meaning this has for me personally, but also because I started this podcast out of a mix of curiosity and really not having my own really good answers on how might I continue to lead into the future? How might I help my students to become leaders that can help us build a better future? What does the future look like for my daughter, your granddaughter, all of the kids that are full of creativity, curiosity, and life, and exploring what that humanistic future looks like? There couldn't be a better person to talk to, really, than you. So I appreciate you leading this off with even just the reality check of the chaos and uncertainty and all of that we're finding ourselves in the middle of. I had a few kind of lead up questions for you, because you have really, as you mentioned earlier, just briefly, your CV and the things you've done and the jobs you've had include being a really successful, one of the early kind of legendary venture capitalists before you started the work that you're doing now. And I don't want to blame it all on the venture capitalists, certainly.
I'll blame them. It's all our fault. We fucked up the world.
And you also, you do, in fact, make CEOs cry. In Reboot, you tackled radical self-inquiry as a key practice for leaders to kind of go down. And I certainly, I would absolutely agree that my own process of radical self-inquiry has hopefully made me a better leader, certainly has had me face a lot of, my own humanity. And then the second book, Reunion, is really kind of grappling with our own heritage, personal heritage, and reuniting with our origin stories, and then the larger societal heritage that we all carry. So why are those topics the topics that you chose to write about in the context of all the work you're doing, working with leaders? And maybe more broadly, do you believe that those are key aspects that if we're redefining leadership, or if we're looking at where leadership is broken and how we can maybe repair it or make it better, those are the starting points?
Okay. So it's going to take a minute or two to sort of respond to this, because it's a complex, compound question. So let me summarize quickly both Reboot and Reunion very quickly. And you're right. Reboot is my first book is really centered on this question of radical self-inquiry. And the most useful way to understand that is through my very popular question, how have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? And a word or two about that. I always use the word complicit, not responsible, because I want to create space for someone not to have a guilt-ridden reaction, but to lean into curiosity and to realize that many of the patterns that we developed as children, we developed to keep ourselves safe, to feel that we're loved, and to think that we belong. And so as a result, we develop these behavioral patterns that serve us, even though we say we don't want them. And part of the process of growing up, right, the subtitle of Reboot is Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. Part of the process of growing up and becoming the human that we were born to be includes confronting these patterns, embracing them, understanding them with curiosity, and learning to move past them, honoring them and moving past them so that we can be the person that we were born to be. Now, why is that important? Because there's this funny phenomena that exists in society, which is that people grow up chronologically. They either by dint of their body, I'm male, I'm straight, I'm white, I'm cis, and by dint of all of that, power is given to me. Now, if I have not done my work, what I tend to do, being in power, is spread my shit around on top of other people who have less power than me. And we see this with our political leadership time and time again, right? I have wounds, and rather than working with my wounds, I'm going to blame somebody else. Oftentimes, I'm going to blame the other, whomever the other is, someone who doesn't look like me, think like me, love like me, feel like me, worship like me. I'm going to blame them. Okay. Which now turns us to reunion. Okay. So if part of the reboot process is to look at questions like, what am I not saying that I need to say, as an indicator of how am I really feeling? Like, no bullshit, like what's really going on inside of me, so that I can discharge my responsibilities as someone who holds power with grace, with compassion, so that I can start to leave the world a better place than when I found it. I was compelled to write Reunion because of, and I tell this story in Reunion, you know this story, my daughter Emma, who figures prominently in both books, and she's the one who's just given birth. Emma, in the summer of 2020, challenged me. And this is in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and in the midst of the COVID pandemic. She joined millions of people and took to the streets and started protesting. And as she was protesting, my fear was for her safety. And one day she's protesting, she's crossing the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan in New York City when the police were sort of hemming in the thousands of protesters. Yeah. And she starts texting me about what to do if they pepper spray her. And I realize I am safe and comfortable on a farm in Colorado. And here is my daughter putting her body on the line for a world that she says she does not want to see. And so the question arose, building on that first question, the new question became, how have I been complicit in and benefited from a world I say I don't want to see? And more importantly, what do I have to give up that I love, like my power, in order to see a world where those who do not look like me can feel love, safety, and belonging? And that, to me, feels like part of a continuum of responsibility. Okay. If you are going to hold power, you have a moral and ethical responsibility to, as my wife says, put your poop in a group, get your shit together. Stop spreading your toxic wounds on other people.
Yeah.
And your responsibility doesn't end at the boundaries of your body or your company. Your responsibility extends to the world at large. Because what is the point of it all, if not to be in community? And so reunion, just like reboot is a necessary step, you have to hit the reboot button and re-describe, repattern yourself. Reunion is also another process, which is, how do I reunite with those who have come before me? How do I reunite with the parts of myself that I'd really rather not look at? And how do I reunite with people that I'm terrified of, the people that I have systemically othered all of my life, so that we can end up in a place that the poet Bell Hooks speaks of in her poem, When Angels Speak of Love, the first line of which is, when angels speak of love, they tell us all things are union and reunion. There is no end to paradise. There is no separation. So I told you it was a long-winded response.
That was also the big question, and I appreciate you taking the time to share this and talk through it. You know, the reason I wanted to open up with this is because I feel like it completely shifts the underlying motivation of anything that you do, the way you show up, and what you ultimately deem to be success as you're being a leader, as you're being a person, obviously, in the world, but specifically a leader. And what's interesting is that I come from a place of 5,000 people town somewhere in Germany, close to the French border, and I grew up in my grandparents' bakery. I tried everything I could, including the stuff that I was doing successfully when we met in Berlin, to escape that place. And there's many reasons for that. But the one thing that I'm finding myself more and more being drawn back to is when you grow up in a place like that, in a place where you make food for other people and you sell it, but not for maximalist capitalistic gain. Yes, you need to make a living, but ultimately a big part of it is community and taking care of each other. And especially, my grandparents started that post World War II. And,
when famine and starvation walked the streets of Germany.
Yes. And my grandpa was 16 years old when he had to go to the front lines and was 21 when he came back, after being imprisoned somewhere in the south of France, not speaking French. But I think it's the one thing that I come back to is the motivation of making something, building a business, providing a service, providing nutrition in form of a business, and also contributing to a community rather than what, I think we've now generally proclaimed is the measurement of success, which is just maximalist capitalistic gain for a small subset of people, because we also equate that with power. Now, the incentive structures built into that system are very, very strong. Both actually the tangible, let's say, financial incentives, but also you don't have to face your own humanity in the way you described that earlier in many ways, so long as you become part of the hamster wheel. So how do you think we reconcile that in terms of we have to shift our own self-understanding, and there's as you and I remember this distinctly, you talked about the crucible moment. Without the crucible moment, you don't often get to the shift, right? Because all of this is sort of masking a lot of the stuff we don't want to look at. What's your take on that? I don't even know how to really phrase the question, but I feel like that's such a foundational
getting a sense of it.
Shift.
So again, it's a compound answer, and it might be useful to think of it as a process. And further metaphorically, it might be useful to think of it as a process of growing up. So if we think about what motivates humans to change, invariably it's suffering. I mean, even the Buddha himself, who was born a prince, with all the indulgences that, an overly protective father would give a child, was inspired for transformation by looking out the window one day and seeing an old woman and realizing in a flash the reality of birth, old age, sickness, and death.
Mm-hmm.
He then sets off on this path, this journey, and your countryman Hermann Hesse wrote of this beautifully in Siddhartha. He sets off on this journey of self-discovery. And the first expression of it is quite performative, right? I'm going to go into the desert and I'm going to be a wandering mendicant and I'm going to outdo everybody and I'm going to be self-flagellating and I'm going to be all of these things. And by the way, we can see this even today when we have so many people who are reacting to the maximalist capitalist structure you've been talking about by taking mushrooms and doing plant medicine and having this almost spiritual bypassing, there, I'll name it, experience that's performative.
Yeah.
The wish behind it is genuine. But are they really, truly willing to travel to the back of the cave and look at the demons? Right? And so the Buddha goes out and he does this experience. And then, and only then, after failing and feeling the suffering of that, and this is the way I perceive him, does he sit down at the base of the Bodhi tree and say, fuck it. Okay, none of that has worked in alleviating my suffering. I'm going to sit under the Bodhi tree until I figure this out. And he wakes up to the universality of suffering, that suffering is a fundamental part of the human experience. And it is only through understanding that experience that the ego, in the midst of its suffering, thinks of itself as alone and doesn't realize that all beings suffer and that the path out of suffering is actually meditation on and compassion with the suffering of others.
Right.
And the movement towards that. So to bring it back to the question you asked, when you ask about a humanistic future and how do we build, say, systemic belonging, to use a term from Reunion that I wrote about, how do we use these incredible mechanisms of power and intellect called companies, called startups, called businesses? How do we use these for good and not for ill? How do we overcome the impulse for hyper-individualism?
Right.
Oh, you mean I have to sit still and contemplate my own suffering? That's step one.
Right.
Step two, which goes right along with it, is, I have to sit still and contemplate the suffering of others? And I don't mean the bullshit sending thoughts and prayers to somebody who's just been mowed down in a mass shooting.
Right.
I mean legitimate, deep and profound actions that are oriented towards the alleviation of suffering. This is Holder talking right now. And what Holder is saying is we hold the stories of the heart so that we can alleviate suffering. And let me tell you, it can be fucking hard to hold somebody's story of suffering, but that is my moral responsibility. That is ancestor to my descendant that I want to be, is someone who's capable of holding suffering.
Now there's two different parts of me responding and asking a follow-on question to that. There's the part of me that, started this podcast and genuinely believes that there's many people willing to and able to and actually doing the work and looking at their own suffering, doing the self-inquiry and also understanding their larger context societally and in a community that they're operating in. And then there's also the reality, which can make you very cynical, of we've now elevated many men, specifically white men, to absolute positions of power that are not exhibiting any of the qualities or the practices we just spoke about. And if I'm listening to you talk about how the only way to change is through suffering and accepting suffering.
No.
With it.
No, let me interrupt. It's not. Okay. It's not that the only way to change is by suffering. It's acknowledging the suffering that exists. But keep going.
Yes. Then, it is easy to get cynical and say, well, then we have to wait for it to get really, really bad for those people to acknowledge their own suffering, which is leading them to amass trillions of dollars and sit in gilded buildings to not have to face their own humanity. So, and I don't know if there's a question here per se, but I think it's a tension that I'm sensing. And I personally chose not to give in too much into the cynical side, but I can see how people listening might be kind of torn in between those places. And what do you think might be a good suggestion or advice for them?
So I acknowledge being drawn into cynicism, maybe even nihilism. And in that place, I acknowledge the impulse to, quote, take care of oneself or one's loved ones. Fuck it, I'll build a wall around everything. And I think of our elders. It's just a coincidence. Above the camera and slightly to the right is a poster that I first placed in this office maybe 18 years ago. And it's a lithograph done by a friend of mine, Hugh MacLeod. And it's a quote from Corinthians. And of course, you'll know it, but I want you to hear it again. Love is patient. Love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. And it's only this moment that I realize the relevancy of that teaching, because 90% of the time I've heard that quoted, it's been at some wedding where it's kind of performative. But if we expand it and link it back to other elders, other wisdom traditions, for example, in Reunion, the epigraph in chapters 7 or 8 comes from the Talmud. And Rabbi Tarfon says then, it is not yours to complete the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect. Love is patient. Love is kind. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. You are not allowed to give up. I'm going to say this again. You are not allowed to give up. If you give over and give in to cynicism, you have become an active participant in creating the world you say you don't want to see.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of a few months ago, there was this controversial interview that Ezra Klein did with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who had actively and openly criticized Ezra Klein in an article. And it ended up being a really great conversation. And I remember Ta-Nehisi Coates specifically calling out the fact that, especially coming from privileged demographics, you have this self-understanding of you do something and you see it through to completion and to success. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's how it landed with me. He said, when you come from a background where, the Black community, or from a background that is underprivileged and has been for centuries, maybe millennia, generations, then yours is the work that just continues, that needs to be done. But you will very much not most likely see it through to the end.
I mean, I just quoted from the Bible. I mean, think of the image of Moses not being able to enter the promised land, having spent 40 years preparing the way.
Right.
I mean, every wisdom tradition speaks of the call to do the work despite the chance of success being so slim.
Yeah. Yeah. Which means that you certainly need to be able, as a leader, hold that compass.
That's right.
Inside of you. Right? To say, there's a set of principles, moral imperative that I carry that has me do this work, despite there being a high chance that I might not see it come to fruition. But I do believe it is the right thing.
Listen, the name of this show is Poets and Thinkers. And what you're reaching for is actually the wisdom implicit in poets and thinkers. Because the truth is, it has been artists and our religious philosophers who have held the keys to civilization, whether it was in the dark ages that followed, the plague in Europe, where it was the monks who kept our education alive. The truth of the matter is, we have always outsourced to poets and thinkers the ability to hold fast to what does it mean to be a human being. And what it means is not only to suffer, but it means to struggle in the face of cynicism. And it's not to make struggle ignoble, because it fucking sucks.
It does.
Okay? Dukkha sucks.
Yeah.
But implicit in the universality of suffering is its own answer. Meaning, just like me, you suffer. I mean, that's why you laughed when I said suffering sucks, because you know what I'm talking about. And so there we are. You and I, across time and space, can reach out, hug each other, and say, yeah, suffering sucks. Okay, dust myself off, try again tomorrow. What, you think you got a right to give up? Fuck that shit. Hope is resistance. Hope is redemptive.
Yeah. It reminds me of one of the yoga classes I once went to, and it was focused on, holding the poses for way longer than you think you can hold them.
Yes.
And it was the teacher was saying that just when you want to get out of the pose is when it actually starts, basically. And so that's probably a really good way to look at it, because you that is where the learning is. That is where the growth happens. And so I think that's a good reminder. I want to switch gears slightly, simply because I want to put this in a context that I know lots of people that are listening, at least to this show, are kind of finding themselves in. I certainly talk to them, and I also even thinking of my students that we're sending out into the world. When we're putting all of what we just talked about in leading in these very strange, uncertain times, and what it means to even lead yourself in order to lead others, and build hopefully a more humanistic future. We need to talk about AI and the current hype narratives, because a lot of what you're talking through and the way you're talking through it also needs, and I know you talk about this a lot, to be able to sit quiet, to slow down, to take a step back for your own self-reflection, to make better decisions. So we're in this hype cycle yet again. It's faster than probably it has ever been. We're being bombarded from all sides, trying to, hit us with even more dopamine, stimulation, all of that. And then I'm reading things like the other day, some estimates and numbers where like McKinsey saying they're estimating about 100 to 300 million jobs will be displaced by 2030. And Elon Musk and SoftBank's Masayoshi Son talk about smart robots replacing entire working populations of people. Obviously, that's a very different worldview that we just talked about. But also, underlying all of that, how do we ensure that we can at least build a counter narrative in this world? How do you lead away from what, to me, when I read it, is people trying everything they can to move away from their own humanity, away from what could potentially cause enough friction and struggle to be exposed to what we described as the more aspirational maybe outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I'm really curious about the feeling that you're holding behind your question. What are you feeling?
I'm feeling a combination of confusion, fear, and hope, which is maybe strange, because I truly believe that we can imagine better futures. I do believe, and that's maybe because I come from the arts and have a sense of kind of creative self-efficacy. But that's probably the cocktail that I'm feeling behind that question.
Yesterday, my youngest son, Michael, and I were texting. I think the headline that we were writing about was, or the piece that we were going back and forth about was this analysis that was written about in the Wall Street Journal, where somehow OpenAI has $1 trillion worth of obligations and is generating only $20 billion a year in revenue. And like the math doesn't add up and all of this stuff. And, I sent him a link to the REM song from the 90s. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. So it's a great song. It's worth listening to, youngsters, if you haven't listened to it. We're in that kind of a moment where I can't tell you what the future's going to hold. What I hear is your wish for that which is human to still be preserved. And I don't know, is it going to be 300 million jobs that disappear? Are we all going to end up being electricians? Are we going to be running data cables into massive data centers and then putting on metaverse glasses and pretending to have a life? I have no fucking idea. What I know is what's in front of me. You know, we're in this age right now where sort of the biggest use case for chatbots is therapy, and by extension, coaching. And so theoretically, I'm one of the, you know, soon to be extinct folks. But what I can tell you is that the demand for my service is higher than it's ever been. So I don't know what that means. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, I'm not going to give up my convictions, my values, my belief systems, my fundamental curiosity in the human heart. I'm not a Luddite. I use the tools. I think the tools are kind of cool. I don't mistake a tool for a human. You know, I recently wrote a piece for LinkedIn on coaching and, you know, from an elder's point of view.
Yeah.
And one of the things I said is that the presence of one who has done their own work is the essence of what a coaching relationship is. I would extend that and say the presence of one who has done their own work is the essence of what builds community. And presence doesn't scale.
Right.
You know, you can create a reasonable facsimile of a human heart, but it's not a human heart.
Right.
And at least as far as the eye can see for me, I don't see that being replaced. And I see a lot of repetitive jobs being replaced.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I see that too. I think as I was listening to you, I was kind of trying to pay attention to what else was going on. I think there's a sadness almost. Maybe it's even a form of grief of, that's a very sad understanding of the world and a very limited view of the world we might want to live in. And at the same time, I totally see and hear you to say, well, that may be it and maybe not. And there's certainly parts of that we do not control, but we can enrich the life that we live individually and the community that we are leading or be part of in a ways that we believe it should be.
Yeah. You know, again, turning to our mythologists and our myth makers and poets, recall the myth of Prometheus. Okay, Prometheus was punished by the gods for stealing fire. What can get lost in thinking about the punishment, right? He was chained forever to a rock and subject to torture and all, was that he stole fire for the benefit of humanity. The technology he stole, which was godlike, was for the benefit of humanity. And there's a warning implicit in that myth, which is that which is intended to save humanity can also burn it to the ground.
Right. Yes.
Which I think is one of the reasons why he was punished. Another reason, of course, was his hubris. And boy, howdy, do we see a lot of hubris going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Man, you know. And so, again, the poets and thinkers that we have to turn to are the elders who say, be careful. Be careful. And I think if we reunite with our understanding of what it means to be our own selves, our own suffering, there is an opportunity to remember the ways in which we need to make sure we don't get burned by that.
Yes. Yes. To wrap us up, Jerry, if there's one piece of advice in these times of uncertainty that you would give, especially to the young people, the people that we will send out into the world, on how to live a full life, and one that maybe inspires others to live more in line with what we just talked about for the last hour almost, what would that be?
Be kind. Be kind. The temptation in the fearful places that we're in is to lose our sense of community and our kindness. I'm not naive. I can get pissed off at the wrong thinking, politically stupid, blah, blah, but that doesn't help anybody. It leads to death and separation. Kindness is a gift. It makes our lives easier. It's not just like holding the door for an elder. It's understanding that the person you disagree with, more often than not, probably suffered something. So sorry to be so simplistic.
It's a powerful message. And I think in the simplicity is exactly what's probably needed right now, because everything is so complex. so scattered and hijacks, our brains and our biology. And it's easy to forget that it's these lessons that truly matter, make a difference. So thank you for that reminder. And thank you again for this conversation and for all your wisdom that has guided me and many others that I know. And it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a delight seeing you again.
Thank you. And that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for listening to Poets and Thinkers. If you like this episode, make sure you hit follow and subscribe to get the latest episodes wherever you listen to your podcast.